Good evening. It is both an honor and a privilege to introduce our distinguished speaker tonight. Khaled Abou El Fadl is no ordinary scholar. When I first met him back in 2002, in the aftermath of the September 11 attacks, what impressed me even back then was not only the brilliance of his intellect, but the unusual integrity of character and the compelling moral vision that he brings to everything he does. These characteristics brought him public recognition very quickly after the attacks for his principled and fearless criticism of extremism and for his stalwart endorsement of the universal values of beauty, morality, justice, and mercy drawn from the Islamic tradition that unite us as human beings. More than a prolific scholar, he is also a prominent public intellectual who has appeared on most major national and international media channels and has published widely in such publications as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, Al Jazeera English, Huffington Post, Boston Review, and many others. His scholarly accomplishments are enviable. Professor Abou El Fadl holds a BA in political science from Yale University, a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and an MA and PhD in Islamic law from Princeton University. He is regarded as one of the world's leading authorities on Islamic law, on Sharia and Islam, and is a prominent scholar in the field of human rights. He is the Alfi Distinguished Professor in Islamic Law at the UCLA School of Law, where he teaches international human rights, Islamic jurisprudence, Islam and human rights, among other topics. He is also the deputy chair of the Islamic Studies Interdepartmental Program at UCLA. Among his many honors and distinctions, he has been awarded the University of Oslo Human Rights Award, the Leo and Liesl Eitinger Prize in 2007, and he was named a Carnegie Scholar in Islamic Law in 2005. He was previously appointed by President George W. Bush to serve on the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom, and he also served as a member of the Board of Directors of Human Rights Watch. His publications are numerous. His latest book is entitled Reasoning with God, Reclaiming Sharia in the Modern Age, considered to be his magnum opus, an intellectual autobiography, and on which tonight's lecture, I believe, is based. His other books include The Great Theft, Wresting Islam from the Extremists, Speaking in God's Name, Islamic Law, Authority, and Women, Rebellion and Violence in Islamic Law, and God Knows the Soldiers, the Authoritative and Authoritarian in Islamic Discourses, Islam and the Challenge of Democracy, The Place of Tolerance in Islam, and my own favorite, if I had to choose only one, The Search for Beauty in Islam, a conference of the books. All these books, I should note, have become classics in the field and are frequently referenced in the scholarly literature. He has lectured on and taught Islamic law throughout the United States and Europe in academic and non-academic environments for over 20 years. His work has been translated into numerous languages, including Arabic, Persian, French, Norwegian, Dutch, Ethiopian, Russian, Vietnamese, and Japanese, among others. So there are other languages that I have not touched upon. And I could go on a bit longer, but I have a feeling that you would rather listen to our speaker addressing probably one of the most contested and emotive topics in today's world. Professor Abou El Fadl's lecture tonight is titled Sharia Law, Reasoning with God and the Challenge of the Unreasonable. Please join me in welcoming Professor Abou El Fadl to the podium.
Asma, as always, thank you so much. It's really a distinct pleasure for me to be with you tonight. Of course, in part, I'm here because of my close friendship with Asma, and who is a brilliant scholar in her own right, and a luminous voice on Islam in the day and age that we live in, where we need illumination on, especially on something that has become the subject of so much bigotry and ignorance and hatred. But I also have to tell you that a part of the reason I've accepted this invitation is my deep appreciation for the late Professor Danner. Of course, I was a very young scholar when I met him once, but it left a very lasting impression on me, and I wish he was alive today, because his voice would be so critical in the environment of Islamophobia that just plagues us everywhere. And so it meant a lot to me to honor him, and honor his memory. All right, well, as Asma mentioned, my lecture is in good part based on the intellectual journey that I have documented, the intellectual journey that maybe is taken up my entire life, documented in Reasoning with God, this fat book in small print. And when you write a fat book in small print, you know that you're going to lose a lot of readers who are just not going to touch it because it's a fat book in small print. But it is based on it with further developments since I've written the book, based on the numerous interventions that I've received since then. And interestingly, one of the very basic critiques that I received from the very beginning is, reasoning with God, who the heck are you to reason with God, the Almighty? Are you seriously suggesting that you are reasoning with God? Well, in part, this reveals an epistemic block that I am going to be talking about. Because there are two ways to look at even just a title, Reasoning with God. I'm possibly talking about reasoning with God in a metaphysical way, in the sense of having conversing with God. But I'm also, the other possibility, and the possibility actually which I had in mind, which I intended, and which the book makes clear, is whether it is better for human beings to reason with God as an integral part of the exercise of human reasoning, or whether in perhaps a libertarian perspective, reason does not need God. And I argue fairly systematically against the classic libertarian view that we can reason, or it is as well to reason without God, without thinking of God in the process, or God being an integral part of the process of human reasoning. But as you will see, that I go beyond that to actually say that at the level of conscientious individual engagement, we all reason with God whether we admit it, confess it, or not. Obviously I'm not talking to a very large Muslim population, but you can imagine in lectures in which it was primarily a Muslim audience, that every time where you feel, why God? Why did you do this to me? Or why didn't I get this promotion? Why didn't I achieve this and that? Why did my child get sick? You in fact do reason with God, and whether you are willing to identify it as that and recognize it as that or not. And the critical point is that if we are honest about the fact that we do reason with God, we do engage God in a process of demanding some form of satisfaction for our faculties as human beings, the closer we are, or the easier it would be for us to avoid unreasonable determinations in life. The unreasonableness that we often see, in my view, plaguing many of contemporary Islamic law determinations in our day and age. Let me start with the alphabet, the very basics. Sharia. Now, I was trained before being trained by Princeton and so on. I was trained at the feet of shuyukh in Egypt, mostly Azhari shuyukh, and in the typical fashion of this training, we always start with language and linguistics. So Sharia derives from the word shara, the root word shara. And I won't go through the lexical, sort of philological engagement of what shara is, but at the very minimum, in linguistically, it is a path to something good. So if shara for cattle, it's a path for where a pasture. A shara for human beings, in the most typical classical linguistic usage, it's the path where they will find water or nourishment. And often in poetry you would find Sharia as the path to water fountain or a water hole, the source for life, sustenance, existence, nourishment. Now, in the Quran, Sharia is used in a variety of senses, and as you might all know, the Quran is believed by Muslims to be God's revelation, the Word of God. We find Sharia used in several contexts that I think are very interesting and deserve our attention. It's used in the derivative context of Shara'a lakum, which the Quranic verse, chapter 42, verse 13, is God has decreed upon you or for you the same commandment or the same shara that God has given Noah, and what we have revealed to you is what we have enjoined upon Abraham and Moses and Jesus. So shara lakum, God has shara lakum, decreed to you the same that has been given to Noah, and the same that has been given to Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. The other usage in the Quran is Shar'an wa minhaja. And the verse goes as follows: we sent to you the scripture with truth, confirming the scriptures that came before it, and with final authority over them. So judge between them according to what God has sent you, and do not follow their whims, so that you may deviate from the truth that has been sent to you. We have assigned a path, a way. We have assigned shar'an wa minhaja. That's the usage. We have assigned shar'an wa minhaja, a path and way. If God would have willed, God would have made you but a single nation. You here refers to human beings, not to Muhammad. But compete in good deeds, for God will see what will you do. This is chapter 5, verse 48. The third Quranic usage for the word shara comes in the phrase shari'atan min al-amr. And this is the way it goes. Now we have sent you a sure path, so follow it. We have sent you shari'atan min al-amr, which usually is translated as sure path. We can have very fascinating linguistic discussions about what shari'atan min al-amr really means, but I'll take the common translation. We have sent you a sure path, shari'atan min al-amr, so follow it, and do not follow the whims of those who are without knowledge. Okay. Now, in this particular Quranic usages, and these are the three contexts in which the Quran uses the word shara or sharia, a variation on the word sharia, sets out very interesting potentialities and very interesting possibilities. Normative, even historical, but as we will talk about in a second, most definitely epistemological possibilities. It would be difficult to talk about the concept of Sharia as it developed in the field of kalam, in the field of theological, normally kalam is thought of as theological disputations, but kalam played a far more important role and influenced by Greek philosophy, and as numerous scholars have shown, that both Kalam and Greek philosophy played a critical role in the development of the very concept of Sharia that would then give birth to a legitimated legal system. And I use this word carefully, because it is one thing to have normative legal deductions that claim to be law, but without legitimacy, without the claim of authenticity and legitimacy, without convincing people that they should obey or should defer, and that's a much better term than obey, that they should defer to what claims to be a normative judgment, is a completely different ballgame. And that's when we start really talking about law, when normative claims start eliciting deference from a human being, is when we start saying we have law or a legal system. If no deference is granted, we don't have a legal system. Now, I won't get into that tonight, but this is a far more sound view of law than the normal positivistic, Austinian, Hartian view of law as the command of a sovereign backed up with the threat of the use of force, which is just deficient at so many levels. But anyway, so it is very difficult to get even a handle on what, how the idea of Sharia itself gets the legitimacy to master deference without using and without exploring another critical Quranic discourse, and that's the discourse on Khilafah or the Khulafa. And here I don't mean the caliphs or the caliphate in a political sense, what ISIS is fighting for, but I mean in the sense that is actually addressed in the Quranic discourse. The Quran itself doesn't actually talk about the caliphate as a political institution. So in the Quranic discourse, human beings are declared khulafa fil ard, the caliphs on earth, viceroys, the deputies of God, and khulafa can in law and in language can only really mean either a deputy or a representative or the inheritor, someone who actually takes over for. So my Khalifa could be anyone that would, for all practical effects, becomes me at some point or another. Now, in law, we slice it and dice it and say, well, you in what sense? It can't be you in a physical sense. It has to be you in some other sense, either metaphysical or legal or, so on and so forth. What lawyers do. Okay, so human beings in my view, are honored and celebrated in this, because God declares human beings, and not Muslims, but human beings, as caliphs of God on earth, capable of doing God-like things. And in the published, what would become the form that you would read as published, I'll jump over the citations issues. As you know, academics always have a hard time ignoring citations and just skipping over them. But anyway, so many narratives accompanying the first 2 centuries and onto the 3rd century of the birth of Islam emphasize that God created human beings in beauty, in husn, and could God have created anything but beauty is an eschatological issue that there is several, it's always debated, but we can say that the consistent argument is that God created human beings in beauty, and that this simple fact of God creating human beings in beauty and declaring human beings the khulafa is sufficient to obligate human beings to act in a beatific fashion, to be obligated by acts of husn. Now, this is critical, because in moral philosophy, even going back to the Jewish philosopher Philo, who says, what is the source of an obligation? What is the source of a moral or legal obligation to do anything? And one way is to come up with a theory of a hypothetical, a philosophical construct that would lead to the conclusion that one is obligated to do X, Y, or Z. Another way is to rely on a creator. And it is significant that Muslim theologians and later on jurists believed that the very endowment of viceroyship and deputyship is the source of obligation for goodness. That as bearers of God's image, that the external beauty of God be reflected by human beings in their inner beauty. So as the Quranic parable goes, God is said to have offered the trust, the amana, to all of creation. But ultimately, all of creation told God in this parable, no, this trust is too weighty for us. Get away from us. We're not gonna bear it. But ultimately, that trust was shouldered by human beings. Then the Quran somberly notes that bearing this trust is so onerous and an arduous task. Well, this weighty trust for which human beings were honored, dignified, in my view, is the marvel of divinity itself. Human beings are nuances of the divine, as I'll quote some of the theologians saying in a second. They are, I argue, inexhaustible anecdotes of divinity capable of creating immeasurable acts of true beauty and divinity. As human beings invent and create beauty, they move, I argue, towards the majestic caliphate of godliness, when human beings no longer seek or create beauty, forget their bonds to the ethereal and sublime, and slump into a state of indolence and despair, human beings drift further away from godliness into its antithesis. So as the Quranic discourse declares, God is the light of the heavens and the earth, that's a Quranic verse, concluding after that God is light upon light. Well, I think it is reasonable to argue that in every act of beauty, in every nuance that commemorates the truth of our divine nature and memorializes the caliphate of humanity in the world, we move closer to that divine light, light of the heavens of the earth, and the light upon light. But in remaining static, in existing without beautification or in false beautification, or in subsisting without service born out of love, mercy, compassion, i.e. without the attributes and nuances of divinity. Again, love, mercy, compassion, which are the attributes and nuances of divinity. We no longer move towards the light. And in fact, we drift from the possibility of godliness to the darkness of godlessness. Now, many theorists, among them Charles Taylor, Roberto Unger, of course, takes it towards a very different trajectory, have emphasized that in modernity there is a chaotic crisis of identity, a state of moral displacement, psychological alienation, a disaffection, an uprootedness of modern globalized Sharia, modern globalized societies. I argue that for those who accept and understand Sharia, Sharia provides an ontological anchor based on the promises of humanity and divinity in conversation. Sharia is premised on an ontological conviction in virtue as a principle, and that there are good qualities of character that allow us to distinguish between the virtuous and the lack of it. In fact, in my view, we human beings, we do not perpetuate evil because of the diabolical craftiness of the devil. We don't need the diabolical craftiness of the devil. All we need is to forget. All we need is to forget the trust of the caliphate. We act ungodly by failing to do good. And before long, the darkness sets in. You are all, I'm sure, familiar with the famous statement about the banality of evil, which is certainly true. But the question is, in my view, what precedes this thoroughly compromised state in which banality leads to evil? What gets human beings to the point where they no longer see a higher version of themselves? What gets us to the point where human beings see themselves something other than being a mere keg in a stale and mundane virtual mill of dehumanization? In my view, the human soul sours sours when its own self-perceptions and existential consciousness drifts into a stillness and prosaicness of being. It moves through a series of corporal attainments impervious to its own ethereal truth, forgetful of the transcendent, and obstinately defiant in recognizing the equal divinity of all. In other words, it no longer believes in its own beauty and goodness or the beauty and goodness of others. Now, in the Islamic tradition, pre-modern scholars differentiated between two essential moral spheres. They differentiated between al-hikmah al-ilahiyya, which we can translate roughly as divine wisdom, and al-hikmah al-insaniyya, which we can translate roughly as human wisdom. Most Muslim scholars argued that wisdom in the sphere of the divine is ontological and thoroughly abstract in the sense that it constitutes the knowledge of the true nature of all things. But al-hikmah al-insaniyya, human wisdom, is ultimately deontonic and practical, in that it inquires into the ethical duties and obligations that follow from the nature of things. Although the boundaries of both spheres of wisdom, the godly and the human, overlap, God's wisdom is founded on certitude, on yaqeen, while human wisdom is based on probability, or as they would put it, dhann. The critical point here is that all wisdom and all knowledge of virtue at the metaphysical level is anchored and affirmed in God, but all wisdom in the created physical world unequivocally belongs to human beings. Effectively, this means that our knowledge of right from wrong is the inquiry into godliness. Our human efforts effectuating and materializing this knowledge through the pursuit of godliness is thoroughly human. We search godliness assured of God's objective and absolute recognition and support of goodness. That goodness exists, that it is a truth. But our human efforts remain just that, human. This epistemological structure allows us to integrate Sharia in the social and political life of Muslims while guaranteeing that God's immutability and absoluteness is not transgressed upon by human beings claiming to have become possessed of and empowered by the consecrations of their egos, actions, or speech. In other words, human beings that become deluded into thinking that they are in fact the embodiment of God. Now, a critical part of this, something that contemporary Muslims have often ignored, if not has become in the realm of the forgotten, is that the Quranic message itself is but a sustained and incessant demonstration of the dynamic of action in partnership with a fully engaged and involved God. This is not a disinterested God. This is not a neutral God, but this is an interested and involved God. And if you again and again, the Quran is but a parable for this sustained and incessant dynamic of a God-human partnership. A state of stagnation, inertia, or lethargy is antithetical to the Quranic message. It is not just that the physical world is in constant motion as in perpetual evolution, as the Quran repeatedly emphasizes, that everything physical is in constant motion, even the mountains and the skies. But not only that, God, in sort of a absolute ways, tells us, and God will create things that you do not know and will not know right now. In other words, there's future creation that we have no idea about, that will come. But human epistemology and its realizations and comprehensions of godliness, beauty, and virtue is in perpetual movement as well. This is the critical point. To argue that a socio-historical matter let me back up for a second and say that Sharia was always understood, constructed, and articulated within the prevalent epistemological parameters of the age. This in itself, there is nothing new in the argument that and in fact, Muslims often repeat the example of Shafi'i when he was in Iraq. He had one set of judgments, and then when he moves to a different epistemological context, to Egypt, he completely changed his determinations, but they don't follow through rationally as to what follows from that. So, but it is naive and misleading to believe that it is possible to avoid or to ignore the epistemological parameters that are allowed by each cultural age, that somehow demonstrations of varied legal determinations in response to altering or contingent epistemologies are relevant only during the period of birth of classical Islamic law, but no longer remain relevant beyond that. It's simply irrational and naive and misleading. It is fair to say that a text, whether Quranic text, as I will argue in a second, or definitely legal texts, invoke an extremely wide range of responses and reactions from readers that more or less share the epistemological universe of the author and readers at a certain point. But when the gap between the time and context of the production of the writing and the circumstances of the reader widen and become ever more different and far more removed, it then takes a great deal of learning and training on part of the dedicated reader to try to master an epistemology that belonged to the author at the time of writing, but is no longer accessible to the reader. And as you know, historically, this is so difficult to do that is why historians often disagree. To capture that epistemological understanding between author and reader in a bygone age is a very, very difficult task. However, when the author of the text is divine, i.e. in this case God, we end up with a different dynamic. And a dynamic that that deserves the rest of our attention, if I might say tonight. We all know that today, the dynamic we have, the reality is, it is quite easy for Muslims to buy and read books of traditions by themselves. Whether they can make proper sense of it is another matter altogether. I mean, thousands of original classical pre-modern sources are available at the press of a button on the net. So for an old ogre like myself, something that I don't like. I don't like the fact that these classical texts are so accessible. But the reality is that these original sources are so historically contingent and contextual that even at the time of their writing and shortly before their writing, they were accessible through well-established social processes to particular classes or segments of the population. That social superstructure that regulated that accessibility has completely crumbled in the modern age. And in fact, these irrepressible developments means that these texts are engaging modern Muslims in epistemological processes, contributing to the creation of terms of selfhood in a fashion that many have described as chaotic, but I would also add unreasonable. Okay. Going back to theological anchoring, because theological anchoring is very important to this argument. Although God is eternal, immutable, and unalterable, according to Islamic theology, at the same time, creation, nature, selfhood, and epistemology is not set definitely in time and space. Creation, selfhood, epistemology, unlike God, are constantly defining and redefining one another. The assertion of disembodied Islamic determinations or rules in the modern age without the contextual legal processes, institutions, and epistemology, and in the absence of legal cultures that generated these determinations in the first place, means that the relationship between contemporary manifestations of Islamic law and the classical legal tradition has been, to say the least, disastrous, and with disastrous consequences. God is immutable and beyond human limitations. But what follows from that? Can we argue theologically that God is subject to epistemological constraints? Although the divine author is not limited by an epistemological understanding, it is possible that God may choose to embrace a historical bounded epistemology as the one epistemology valid for all times and places. This is the classic argument of so many, whatever you want to call them, fundamentalists, literalists, Salafis, is that God chose to embrace historical moment with all its epistemological contingencies and willed it forever normatively for human beings. But there is a serious problem with this position because it means that God intended to lock the epistemology of the 7th century into the immutable text of the Quran, and then intended to hold Muslims hostage to this epistemological framework for ages to come. Among other things, this would limit the dynamism and effectiveness of the concept of the divine text itself, because God forever, and the Quran forever, would be locked within a knowledge paradigm that is very difficult even for specialists to retrieve or recreate, leave alone engineers and computer scientists that hit the net. But even more, it would stand to reason from a purely theological point of view, again, that since the author of the Quran is God, divine, that this author, this God, the author of the Quran, would have the foreknowledge that there will be dramatic shifts and evolutions that are going to take place in human epistemologies and methods of knowledge. As Muslim theologians would have put it, because God has foreknowledge of coming challenges and changes, then God, by virtue of God being merciful and compassionate, would necessitate that God would enable Muslims to have the tools and means of effectively dealing with these coming challenges. In essence, knowing that human beings will achieve major changes in the technology of acquiring, retrieving, and storing data, and that doing so will alter their state of consciousness, perceptions, comprehensions, and sensitivities, it is inconceivable that God would leave Muslims with a revelation that is not fully equipped to deal with these defining challenges in every age. All right, so bear with me. I know that sometimes, especially if you're not accustomed to Islamic theology, it could be a little bit of a heavy dosage. I plead for your patience. Many of my fellow Muslims, let me put it, we are between two choices, right? a God that locks human beings into an epistemological moment of the 7th century and forever obligates them to retrieve it, or a God that foresees changes to come and empowers, as a merciful and compassionate and caring and loving God, empowers God's vicegerents, God's agents, empowers them to handle the fact that the very psychology, the very consciousness, of human beings will shift from, not just from one century, but from one decade, sometimes from one year to another, in dramatic and drastic fashions. These are two choices. And the problem with the first choice is that it flies in the face of a merciful and compassionate God, and it also flies in the face of a reasonable God. Because, as the legal maxim goes, that طلب الاستحالة محال, that asking for the impossible is a legal impossibility, right? So it's a circular, for us to retrieve the epistemologies of the 7th century, or to be locked in it, would doom us to accepting the idea of an unreasonable God. I'm skipping, as you know, as always happens, you've all presented, you decide to skip pages and pages of your presentation. So now, what is the way out? That merciful and compassionate God systematically, as we said, in a demonstration of an actual dynamic of a discourse and an engaged God, in fact, often engaging Muslims at the time of revelation in outright conversation, reasoning with God. God reasons with Muslims at the time of revelation. In fact, at one point tells them, don't ask questions you don't want to know the answer to, because if you do, God could make your life far more difficult. What is that if it's not reasoning with God? Or God saying, God heard the woman who came to complain about her husband. God hears your conversations. Here's what you do about this problem. What is that if it's not reasoning with God?